Gentlemen, the Bismarck engagement demonstrated the critical importance of maintaining this specific firing solution trajectory.
This section here, it's structurally weak.
We need more reinforcement before the keel is laid.
We interrupt this broadcast with a special bulletin. The Imperial Japanese Navy has attacked Pearl Harbor.
My God, look at this. This means war.
Move the Hellcat forward!
Aye, 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 sir. Clear the deck.
January 1940. Newport News, Virginia. Morning fog hangs low over the James River. Steel gantry cranes stand still, their silhouettes frozen against a pale winter sky. Along the piers, the sound is muted. Only the distant clatter of tools, the echo of footsteps on cold metal decks. This is one of the largest shipyards in the Western Hemisphere, and yet it is quiet. Too quiet for a world on the edge of collapse. Across the Atlantic, Europe is already burning. Poland has fallen. Britain braces for what comes next. In the Pacific, Japanese carrier task forces train relentlessly, refining a form of naval warfare that few truly understand. Aircraft, not guns, are becoming the decisive weapon at sea. Here in America, the United States Navy looks strong on paper. Rows of battleships, heavy cruisers, tonnage counted and cataloged. But beneath the numbers is a dangerous absence. There are too few aircraft carriers, too few flight decks, too little capacity to build them quickly. At Newport News, the slipways were never designed for what is coming. The docks were built for battleships, not floating airfields. But the war does not wait for redesigns. And soon, silence will give way to urgency. The problem facing the United States Navy in 1940 did not begin with war. It began with assumptions. For decades after the First World War, naval power was measured in armor thickness and gun caliber. Battleships were symbols of national strength. Floating fortresses meant to meet the enemy line to line. Aircraft carriers existed, but they were treated as auxiliaries. Scouts. Support platforms for the fleet's heavy guns. This mindset was reinforced by policy. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the London Naval Treaties that followed imposed strict limits on capital ship construction. Carrier tonnage was capped. Hulls were scrapped. Programs slowed. The goal was stability, not speed. For the United States, still haunted by the memory of 1917's late mobilization, restraint felt responsible. By the late 1930s, the U.S. Navy operated only a handful of fleet carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Wasp. They were valuable, but few. Their air wings were limited. Their protection was debated. In naval war colleges, carrier doctrine was still evolving, often treated as experimental rather than decisive. Meanwhile, other powers were moving faster. Japan, constrained by treaty limits, but driven by geographic necessity, invested heavily in carrier aviation. Its naval planners understood that any Pacific war would be decided by range, by who could strike first, farthest, and hardest. By 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled the most experienced carrier air arm in the world, training pilots relentlessly in coordinated, long-range strike operations. Britain, fighting for survival after 1939, also leaned increasingly on carriers to protect convoys and project power where battleships could not safely operate. The United States observed all of this, but cautiously. Neutrality laws restricted involvement. Congress debated funding. Isolationism remained politically powerful. Even as war spread, American rearmament moved deliberately, not urgently. This caution extended to industry. Newport News Shipbuilding, founded in the late 19th century, was a cornerstone of American naval construction. It had built battleships, cruisers, and auxiliary vessels for decades. Its workforce was skilled. Its facilities were massive. But its layout reflected past priorities. Dry docks sized for battleships. Production rhythms measured in years, not months. Aircraft carriers posed a different challenge entirely. They required enormous, uninterrupted flight decks, complex internal hangar spaces, aircraft elevators capable of lifting fully loaded planes, arresting gear systems still undergoing refinement. They demanded precision welding and structural alignment on a scale few yards had ever attempted at speed. In 1940, Newport News could build carriers, but could not build many of them, and it could not build them fast. As winter turned to spring, reports arriving in Washington painted an increasingly stark picture. Naval intelligence assessed Japanese carrier strength with growing concern. British losses underscored the vulnerability of surface fleets without air cover. War games conducted by the U.S. Navy repeatedly demonstrated the same conclusion. Fleets without sufficient carriers were blind, slow, and fatally exposed. The gap between doctrine and reality was narrowing. By mid-1940, the question was no longer whether aircraft carriers would matter. It was whether the United States could produce enough of them in time. That question led directly back to the quiet shipyards along the James River, yards that would soon be asked to do something they had never done before. The summer of 1940 shattered remaining illusions of distance and safety. France collapsed in 6 weeks. Paris fell. The British Expeditionary Force escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment, certainty, and the belief that traditional military timelines still applied. In Washington, the shock was immediate. If France could fall so quickly, oceans were no longer guarantees. They were buffers, thin ones. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the implications. Long before America formally entered the war, he began pushing the nation toward readiness. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, signed in July 1940, authorized the largest naval expansion in U.S. history. It called for a 70% increase in fleet size, including a dramatic rise in aircraft carrier construction. On paper, the decision was bold. In practice, it was daunting. Carrier hulls required steel in unprecedented quantities. Engines, turbines, electrical systems, aviation fuel storage, and radar installations all competed for resources already strained by rearmament. Skilled labor was limited. Supply chains were fragile. Time was the one commodity the Navy did not have. The Navy Department turned again to Newport News. There were reasons beyond tradition. Newport News was one of the few American shipyards with the physical space to expand. Its proximity to steel suppliers, rail networks, and Atlantic sea lanes made it strategically invaluable. Most importantly, it had a workforce capable of adapting. Engineers who could redesign processes, foremen who could train new laborers at scale. But transformation would not be incremental. It would be violent in its speed. Dry docks were lengthened. New cranes rose above the skyline, towering over older structures like industrial monuments. Assembly methods changed. Modular construction, still novel in naval shipbuilding, was adopted to compress timelines. Hull sections were built simultaneously, then joined, rather than assembled sequentially. Thousands of workers flooded into the yard. Men from rural Virginia, migrants from the Midwest, women entering industrial labor in numbers never seen before. Training programs ran day and night. Mistakes were costly, but stopping was not an option. Design offices worked in parallel with construction crews. Carrier plans evolved even as keels were laid. Armor schemes were revised. Flight deck layouts adjusted. Aircraft elevators strengthened. Lessons from British and Japanese carrier operations filtered into American designs almost in real time. The pressure was constant. Naval planners no longer spoke in decades. They spoke in months. Every delay was measured against hypothetical losses. Convoys sunk, fleets caught without air cover, bases left exposed. Newport News was no longer just building ships. It was racing an invisible clock. By late 1940, the shipyard no longer resembled its January self. The quiet was gone. The fog burned off beneath floodlights. Welding arcs lit the night sky. Steel moved continuously, never resting long enough to cool. The expansion was no longer a proposal. It was irreversible. And with each passing week, the United States edged closer to a reality in which aircraft carriers would not support the fleet, but define it. That realization set the stage for forces far beyond steel and machinery. Forces that would reshape doctrine, lives, and the nature of naval war itself. The expansion of Newport News Shipbuilding was not a single story. It unfolded along multiple lines at once: human, industrial, and technological, each shaping the others under relentless pressure. Shipyards are systems. When one element slows, everything slows. In 1940, Newport News was forced to rethink those systems entirely. Traditional shipbuilding followed a linear path: keel laid, hull raised, systems installed, fittings completed. It was methodical, predictable, and far too slow for the moment now unfolding. To accelerate carrier production, the yard adopted parallel construction. Hull sections were fabricated in separate bays. Flight deck supports were assembled off-site. Components arrived by rail already partially completed. Cranes no longer waited. They rotated continuously, lifting steel from staging areas to slipways in a steady, almost mechanical rhythm. New dry docks were poured while ships were already under construction. Rail spurs cut through older sections of the yard. Warehouses were repurposed overnight. Efficiency replaced elegance. Speed replaced tradition. Every square foot of space became contested ground. Behind every plate of steel stood a worker learning on the move. Many had never seen an aircraft carrier before. Fewer still understood how complex these ships truly were. Welders trained on battleships now faced thinner deck, plating requiring precision to prevent warping. Electricians ran miles of cable through cramped hangar decks designed to house squadrons of aircraft, not just machinery. Fatigue was constant. Shifts blurred together. 12-hour days became routine. Yet morale remained surprisingly resilient. There was pride in the work, an awareness that these ships mattered in ways battleships once had. Women entered the yard in growing numbers, trained as welders, inspectors, and riveters. Their presence reshaped the workforce and accelerated production. Skill mattered more than tradition now. Mistakes happened. Injuries occurred, but stoppages were brief. The yard learned, adapted, and pressed forward. The technological angle. Aircraft carriers were not simply large ships. They were moving air bases, each system interdependent. Flight decks had to withstand repeated impacts from landing aircraft. Arresting gear required precise calibration. Elevators had to lift aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance repeatedly without failure. Ventilation systems were redesigned to clear aviation fumes. Fire suppression became a primary concern after early carrier accidents highlighted the danger of fuel fires below deck. Radar installations, still in their infancy, were integrated into superstructures never originally intended to carry such equipment. Each innovation introduced risk, but standing still introduced more. By late 1941, Newport News was no longer experimenting. It was executing at scale, turning theory into steel with a confidence born of necessity. And yet, even as the yard pushed its limits, larger questions loomed. Questions about strategy, leadership, and an enemy whose own carriers were already at sea. Those questions shaped the next layer of this transformation. Beyond the shipyard gates, the consequences of expansion rippled outward, shaping strategy, leadership decisions, and the perception of the enemy itself. For the U.S. Navy, carrier construction was not just an industrial problem. It was a doctrinal reckoning. Pre-war fleet exercises had hinted at carrier dominance, but battleships still dominated budgets and prestige. The events of 1940 forced a recalibration. Carriers offered reach. They extended the fleet's eyes and fists hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. They allowed commanders to strike without exposing surface ships. But they also demanded protection, coordination, and a willingness to accept risk. As Newport News accelerated production, naval planners adjusted operational concepts accordingly. Task forces were reorganized around carriers, not battleships. Escort screens were redesigned. Logistics planning shifted to support aviation fuel and spare aircraft as critical supplies. The yard's output shaped strategy as much as strategy shaped the yard's output. This transformation required leadership willing to break precedent. Navy Department officials approved design changes mid-construction. Shipyard executives accepted inefficiency in the short term to gain speed overall. Roosevelt himself followed carrier production closely, understanding their symbolic and strategic value. Decisions were made quickly, often without full information. There was no luxury of perfection. What mattered was momentum. Newport News became a proving ground for a new relationship between government and industry, one defined by urgency, trust, and shared risk. Across the Pacific, Japanese planners watched American shipbuilding with concern but confidence. Their carriers were already operational. Their pilots were battle-tested in China. They believed the United States would take years to catch up. What they underestimated was American industrial elasticity. The expansion at Newport News signaled something deeper than ship numbers. It revealed a capacity to absorb shock, reorganize, and produce at a scale few nations could match once fully mobilized. By late 1941, both sides stood on the edge of open conflict. Carriers were no longer theoretical instruments. They were central pieces on the board. And when war finally arrived, it would test whether steel laid in haste could survive fire, distance, and loss. That test was closer than anyone in the yard could yet imagine. December 7th, 1941. The news reached Newport News in fragments. Radio bulletins shouted headlines, hurried conversations along the docks. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Battleships burned at their moorings. Aircraft carriers, by chance, were at sea. In a single morning, every lingering debate ended. What naval planners had argued in war games was now written in smoke and oil across the Pacific. Battleships, the pride of fleets, lay crippled. Aircraft carriers, scarce, overstretched, and suddenly indispensable, were the only instruments capable of striking back. At Newport News, the shift was immediate and absolute. Construction schedules were torn up and rewritten. Timelines once measured in years were compressed into months. Authorization barriers vanished. Materials were diverted. Priorities were rewritten overnight. The shipyard moved from expansion to total war footing without pause. Floodlights burned through the night. Welding arcs flared until dawn. Crews rotated in overlapping shifts, handing off unfinished sections without ceremony. Hulls rose faster than anyone thought possible, steel skeletons taking shape against the Virginia sky. The Navy demanded carriers not as future assets, but as emergency necessities. Design compromises were accepted. Some fittings were deferred. Non-essential comforts vanished. What mattered was flight decks, engines, aviation fuel systems, and the ability to survive damage long enough to keep launching aircraft. Every day lost now had a cost measured in ships sunk and lives taken thousands of miles away. Reports from the Pacific sharpened the pressure. Japanese carrier task forces struck with precision, operating far from home bases, proving the very doctrine American planners had only recently embraced. The United States did not need better arguments. It needed holes in the water. At Newport News, keels were laid with an urgency bordering on desperation. The Essex-class carriers, designed before the war but now accelerated beyond precedent, became the yard's central focus. These ships were larger, tougher, and capable of carrying more aircraft than any previous American carrier. There were also unfinished ideas being forced into reality. Mistakes could not stop progress. Damage reports from early carrier battles informed ongoing construction. Armor thickness was adjusted. Compartmentalization improved. Firefighting systems were reinforced. Lessons written in blood were incorporated in steel. By early 1942, the shipyard no longer worked toward readiness. It worked toward survival. And as hulls neared completion, another challenge emerged, turning industrial output into operational power fast enough to change the course of the war. The true turning point came not with a single launch, but with a rhythm. Carriers began to slide down the ways in sequence, one after another, each launch compressing the gap between American intention and American capability. Newport News, once constrained by its own infrastructure, now set the tempo. The Essex-class carriers embodied the transformation. Their flight decks stretched longer than earlier designs. Their hangars were enclosed for better protection. Their machinery spaces were divided for survivability. They were not perfect ships, but they were adaptable, and they could be built in numbers. Workforces matured alongside the ships. What had begun as rushed training evolved into practiced efficiency. Crews anticipated problems before they formed. Foremen coordinated across departments without waiting for directives. The yard functioned as a single organism, reacting to stress with speed rather than hesitation. Each completed carrier altered the strategic equation. As new ships joined the fleet, American naval operations expanded. Carrier task forces grew deeper, more resilient. Losses could be absorbed. Damage no longer meant paralysis. Where the early war had been defined by scarcity, the middle years began to show redundancy. Japanese planners noticed the shift. Battles that once hinged on narrow margins now tilted. Aircraft losses could be replaced. Deck crews refined procedures learned through hard experience. Industrial output fed operational confidence, and confidence fed aggression. The shipyard contribution was no longer abstract. It was visible in after-action reports, in strike ranges extended, in the ability to sustain pressure across vast distances of ocean. By 1943, the United States was no longer reacting. It was advancing. The climax was not a single day or decision. It was the moment when the carrier gap closed and then reversed. When Newport News and other yards proved that speed, scale, and adaptation could overpower early advantage. From that point forward, the question was no longer whether America could build enough carriers. It was how decisively they would be used. That answer would unfold in the war's wake, measured in outcomes, losses, and a reshaped naval world. By the time the war reached its middle years, the consequences of the carrier expansion were no longer theoretical. They were visible across the Pacific in steel silhouettes, moving with confidence, supported by air wings that could strike farther, faster, and more often than before. The new carriers entering service transformed how the United States fought. Task forces no longer centered on preserving a few irreplaceable hulls. They were built for endurance. Losses were tragic, but they were no longer catastrophic. Damaged carriers rotated home for repair while others took their place. The fleet remained present. Pressure remained constant. Operational reports reflected the shift. American commanders increasingly dictated the tempo of engagements. Strikes were planned days in advance, supported by intelligence and logistics networks that could sustain long campaigns. Carrier groups supported amphibious landings, isolated enemy bases, and shielded advancing forces across thousands of miles of open ocean. Numbers told part of the story. By war's end, the United States had commissioned dozens of fleet and light carriers. The Essex class alone formed the backbone of the Navy's striking power. Each represented thousands of hours of labor, millions of rivets and welds, and an industrial rhythm first proven under the lights of expanded shipyards like Newport News. The psychological effect was just as important. American sailors began to trust their fleet's depth. Confidence replaced caution. Pilots launched knowing replacements existed. Not just aircraft, but ships to land on. Commanders planned operations with the expectation of sustained support rather than fragile superiority. Newport News itself became a strategic asset. Its output was discussed in planning rooms and intelligence estimates. Enemy analysts tracked American shipbuilding with growing alarm, recognizing that industrial momentum now favored the United States decisively. The shipyard was no longer simply responding to war. It was shaping its outcome. And yet, the full meaning of that transformation extended beyond victory alone, into doctrine, memory, and the future of naval power. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the shipyards did not return to their old identity. Newport News emerged from the war permanently changed, physically expanded, organizationally transformed, and culturally reshaped. The infrastructure built in haste became the foundation for post-war naval dominance. Dry docks designed for wartime emergency now supported a peacetime fleet that understood the carrier as its core instrument. The Navy absorbed the lesson completely. Battleships, once the measure of power, receded into ceremonial roles. Aircraft carriers became the centerpiece of strategy, diplomacy, and deterrence. The war had settled the debate decisively, and the answer was written in steel laid between 1940 and 1943. The industrial lessons endured as well. Modular construction, parallel workflows, and government. Industry coordination became standard practice. The ability to surge production under pressure was no longer theoretical. It was proven. For the workforce, the aftermath was personal. Many who had arrived as trainees left as masters of their craft. Women who had entered industrial labor in wartime did not simply vanish from the workforce. They changed expectations permanently. Communities around the shipyard grew, stabilized, and remembered the years when the night sky glowed with welding arcs. Historians later noted that no single battle alone secured victory in the Pacific. It was the accumulation of capacity, the steady arrival of carriers that could replace losses and exploit success, that broke the enemy's ability to recover. Newport News was part of that accumulation. Its story illustrated a broader truth. Wars are not only won at the front. They are decided in places far from gunfire, where urgency meets organization, and where decisions made under pressure reshape the future. That realization invites a final reflection, one that looks beyond timelines and tonnage toward meaning. The expansion of Newport News shipbuilding did not begin with explosions or speeches. It began with an absence, too few carriers, too little time, and a quiet yard standing at the edge of necessity. History often remembers moments of impact. Battles won, fleets sunk, flags raised. But the deeper forces that shaped those moments move earlier and more quietly. They move through blueprints altered at midnight, through hands learning new skills under floodlights, through decisions made without certainty, only urgency. In 1940, the United States did not possess the carrier strength it would soon need. What it possessed instead was capacity to adapt, to expand, and to accept discomfort in exchange for speed. Newport News became the embodiment of that choice. Steel replaced hesitation. Production replaced debate. The aircraft carriers that emerged from slipways were more than weapons. They were statements of intent. Each deck represented a belief that preparation could outrun disaster, that organization could counter surprise, and that time, if seized aggressively, could be turned from enemy into ally. The legacy of that transformation endured long after the war ended. Carrier-centered fleets shaped global strategy. Industrial mobilization became a cornerstone of national security planning. The lessons learned under pressure informed generations who never heard the sound of welding arcs at night, but benefited from their consequences. In the end, Newport News reminds us that history is not only written where violence occurs. It is written where decisions are made before violence becomes unavoidable. And sometimes the future turns not on a battlefield, but on how fast a nation learns to build what it once believed it could delay.